Up to this point, we've been using Angular for the last month or so, and for the client side, right, where we've been using this model view controller MVC library to build web applications, at least the client side of the web application, using this design pattern, right, that forces you to build applications in a particular structure, right, where it breaks up various pages and content and JavaScript into certain roles, right? There's the HTML that serve as templates, right? That iterate or receive data from a controller. That inside of the template they decide how it's structured, how it's to display it out to the user. Whereas the controller, the JavaScript, their role is to interact with the end user, receive events, get data, and then provide that data to the view for rendering, right? So there are very specific roles for each one of these artifacts, right? Now underneath it all, at some point the JavaScript needs to actually manipulate the DOM, right? The raw DOM that the browser is rendering, right? Up to this point, we haven't seen that any JavaScript, right? Up to this point, has never modified any HTML, any DOM. Right? We see the controllers and services that we've been writing. They don't care about the DOM at all. Right? They don't know about any HTML, any templates, any classes, any IDs, any divs or spans or nothing. Right? They don't care anything about the underlying DOM. Who's responsible for manipulating the DOM is the template HTML. Okay, which we use these Angular directives that all start with ng, right? ng-repeat, ng-switch, ng-ifs, ng-show, and all these ng directives, which I'd like to introduce for you today. So these directives are the ones responsible for actually interacting with the underlying DOM, right? We can look at the DOM if we inspect any page. We can take a look at it. If we click on the Elements tab, this is the interpretation. This is how the browser interprets your page, right? This is the object representation of the page that is rendered on the left-hand side, right? The raw HTML gets downloaded from the server. Here it is. This is the raw HTML, the ASCII text file that gets parsed by the browser. And the browser generates this object on the right-hand side, okay? And then once it generates this object, it then renders what's on the left-hand side. Yes, right? And you can hover over each one of these objects and notice that it highlights on the left-hand side, what part of the object is represented in what part of the screen. Right, that this div is rendered on the left-hand side and it's highlighted there. Right? This nav is rendered right here, and so on and so forth. Make sense? Right. So JavaScript, if you're using Angular or any other JavaScript library, it needs to, if it's generating dynamic content like we are using Angular, all these ng repeats, right? They're iterating over arrays of objects and whatnot, right? They need to be able to eventually manipulate this DOM, right? Add nodes into this DOM dynamically. And Angular does this for us, but we don't see any of that, right? Because all that is hidden behind the curtain, right? It's hidden behind a layer of abstraction, right? That forces us to think about this in an object-oriented manner, right? We give it an object, and then from a controller we give it an object or an array of objects, right? And then on the client, we grab that object or array of objects, and we use these constructs that allow us to iterate over arrays, right? Or do all this logic, whether we display certain things or not, based on certain criteria, right? But we never actually manipulate the DOM. All that is hidden from us, right? So I'd like to look a little bit behind that curtain of what is Angular doing, right, to manipulate this DOM. Right? Behind the scenes, Angular uses a library called jQuery. Right? jQuery is a very popular library that allows you to manipulate the DOM at its, at a raw level, right? Be as close as you can to the DOM, right? To manipulate the DOM directly without actually using raw JavaScript. Okay. What happens is that raw JavaScript has a problem, right? That it's a historical problem based on the evolution of the browser wars, right? And also on the proliferation of the versions of the JavaScript language, right? How it has evolved over time, and how browsers support various versions of the language. Okay, so early on, JavaScript was invented or designed for programmers to be able to interact with the browser, right? In particular, being able to manipulate the DOM, right? And as the popularity of JavaScript grew, and many vendors jumped in on this browser wars, right? IE, and you have Chrome and Safari, and all this proliferated. You had a little bit of fragmentation between the supported features of the language across different vendors, across different versions of the language. Okay, and oftentimes when developers found themselves writing all sorts of switch cases or if else everywhere, checking to see which version of the browser were you writing for. Right? It was just a nightmare to be able to support the same features across all browsers, across different versions of the language. Okay, so over time the industry grabbed all these various design patterns, right, of how to deal with various vendors, various versions of the language, and they started to create APIs, higher level APIs, to so that we could encapsulate some of that logic of figuring out how to behave, how to target different vendors, different versions, and fast forward a couple of years later, we have jQuery. jQuery allows us to encapsulate all these various logic into one single consistent API, right? So jQuery is it's a very popular library that abstracts the browser, so that you don't have to think about the idiosyncrasies of one particular vendor browser versus another, right? jQuery provides this thin layer so that it figures out, right? If you ask it to change a color of something, it will figure out what version of the browser, what version, and it will do the right thing depending on the vendor, right? So I'd like to talk about a little bit about jQuery and what can be done, and also one of the more popular sister libraries, jQuery UI, or jQuery user interface, right? That is also an extension. It's an extension to the jQuery core library that provides all sorts of really nice behaviors to make your application more dynamic. And so jQuery is as close as you'll be to manipulating the DOM, but without actually using raw JavaScript. Okay, it's all written already in JavaScript, right? But it creates this thin layer between you and the underlying DOM. Yes. All right. So let's play around with jQuery. Right, so jQuery can be downloaded from here. Download jQuery. The latest version is 3.11. Okay, and I've already installed it locally on my machine, and I like to play around with it a little bit. All right.